Is Arknights' story cooked? No, maybe, kinda. It's hard to say, for you at least, cause my answer is definitely no. I have my complaints, I'm sure everyone does, but I ultimately fall on the side of Arknights' story being in a pretty good spot. It's evolved quite a bit since the game's dropped, but mostly for the better, in my opinion. There are 3 areas I want to discuss in regards to the state of Arknights' story, which are the main story itself, event stories, and the lore of the game in general. Starting off with our main story, and we've come a long way from the Doctor's awakening to the absolute devastation of Victoria in Chapter 13. And with that has come a lot of changes, for better and for worse. And I'm not going to be talking about the format. This is a visual novel style story. If your main issue with the game's story is that format, you might want to start searching for another game. I know that might sound very harsh, but until Enfield comes out, this is the format we're stuck with. I would like to see some slight quality of life updates, like changing the text size or faster auto read speed, but other than stuff like that, we're stuck in a visual novel. We're going to have to wait till Enfield to get some different format for Arknights stories. With all that being said though, the main change of course is the length, with early chapters being around an hour long, and with current chapters being around 8 hours long. So if you think dedicating a lot more time to read the main story isn't worth it, well, then you're going to think this is a bad change. Me personally, I enjoy it. If you want to tell a good story, you need the time to tell it. And I think Arknights is more than willing to give the game the time to tell its stories. Now, the game's wording. It uses a lot of flowery language. That could be due to translating from Chinese to English, but you know, the translation team could always take some liberties in order to simplify things and make reading easier. But I do appreciate them staying faithful to the original intent. Additionally, the storytelling scale has changed. During Act 0 and Act 1, the story was very focused on a lower scale, lower stakes story. The battle for infected rights across Chernobog and Lungmen. Whereas in Act 2, the Victorian crisis is far larger in scale. The Victoria crisis has far more players involved, and as such, a new issue is raised. It's congested. The cast has bloated, the factions at play has bloated. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it does allow a lot more, I suppose, liberty when you're telling your story. There's a lot more moving parts, complexity, yada yada yada, increases. Not necessarily for the better, but it does definitely allow them to tell additional stories. And that's pretty obvious when you look at, say, What the Firelight casts, where they took Reed's story, set up in the main story, and gave it its own entire event. Now, currently that's the only one they've done that for, but you know what I mean. Storytelling opportunities presenting itself as the story develops. It's not all rainbows and sunshine though. Due to this larger scale of stories, the characters of our villains have started to suffer. Now we get a larger focus on telling the story itself, where character development is split between this larger cast. As such, instead of having incredibly memorable characters like Frost Nova, Patriot, and Tallulah, we get Mandragora, Manfred, the Damaski Cluster, and the Sanguinarch. Not necessarily bad characters, but just based on what I've taken in from the fandom, nowhere near as beloved as those original characters. Me personally, I like that the scale has increased, but maybe they have pushed it just a bit too far. Now, that's not the end of the world, but I am praying on Teresa's to knock out of the park when the story decides to focus on him. If they nail Teresa's and we get a modern Tallulah, I'm going to be super happy, because that will prove that they still got that in their bag when they need to pull it out. And from what I've heard, Chapter 14 does a pretty fantastic job with its character stuff. However, it's still not great that most of our memorable villains have come from the first act of the game. We still do get plenty of memorable heroes, mind you. A lot are just being built up from before Act 2, and our stories aren't likely to end with Act 2. So I think the villains being a bit weaker is a larger issue than the hero focus. It might have gone to a larger scale, but the Victoria crisis has been pretty great overall, and I am looking forward to the conclusion. Also, Amia, she's still best girl, best daughter, and I hope we can protect her from the upcoming trauma she's about to get. Arknights events have always varied wildly in quality, but overall they are in a pretty good place. Arguably, the best bit of Arknights content comes from an event, Lone Trail, my beloved. Aside from that, I think we got a great spread of content that tell us one-off adventures across the land of Terra. From Sami to Colombia, Casimirs to Yan, we had a wide variety of stories. Quality varies from your summer events to your sweet swibbling events, so whenever you open one up, you never know quite what you're going to get. Cause you could really love the Sui events and hate the Seaborn events, and I could hate the Sui events and love the Seaborn events. So your personal taste when it comes to events is going to vary massively. Me personally, I love the variety, and I would argue that they make up far more enjoyment of the game's stories than the main story to myself. You might not agree with that. You might say you're here purely for the main story. Me personally, I'm here waiting for the next Null event. Currently, events are building up Kerag, Latania, Sancta, and Blacksteel storylines, and Null and the Abyssal Hunter storylines are continuing to be built upon like they have from the beginning of the game. So event storylines are going pretty strong, and I'm sure you have all varying opinions on whether certain characters deserve to be focused on or not. Length of events vary wildly, from Neolight and Lone Trail being larger and longer than main story chapters, to some events barely being 4 hours long. A pretty great spread, but once again, you don't know what you're getting until you start reading, unless it's an anniversary event. Now, I get the feeling more people complain about the main story than they do about event stories. And I kind of agree that the main story should be held to a little bit higher standard, but if you are complaining about event stories being too long or taking up too much time throughout the year, I can see where you're coming from, especially if you're a new player trying to catch up, or an old player who missed a few events and now you're stuck with a rerun of an old event you didn't read, and it's basically just back-to-back reading. And if you are in that position, know that your effort now will save you next year. That might not sound like much, but it is a little bit of a consolation prize. Now, if you're up to date with the story, up to date with the events, that means you can just hop in no matter what's on and just read the new content and not worry about the rerun content. Finally, Arknights lore. Overall, it's pretty great. All the events get to show us different aspects of the fascinating lore the game has in store for us. In the last few months, we finally got a look at the wondrous land of Sami, which I will give its own video to eventually, and it was received with open arms. And I often see people on Twitter asking for the lore book to get an English translation. Then now, if you don't know about it, it's a 450 plus page book just giving little lore tidbits on the world of Terra, and it's written from an in-universe perspective. It's probably going to be massively overpriced if it does come in an English translation, but I will be buying it. Yoastar, Hippogriff, if you want to make some extra money, you know what to do. However, there is one issue I have with the lore. It's not currently game-breaking or currently threatening to ruin the story's lore, but I want to acknowledge it, and that is the dock lore. The dock lore, it's great, and that's probably not what you're expecting me to say when I just told you I think it's an issue. But the dock lore has one major issue, and that is that it's threatening to consume the game's background. And not just the Babel stuff. I'm talking about the prehistory stuff. An absolutely insane amount of background fluff is being attributed to the Dock's civilization, which is fine, except when it's a massive increase in the sci-fi lore of the game. And I don't think it's a huge issue now, but depending on how they develop this aspect of the game's lore, it may break the lore for me. Especially because I want the lore to not be completely associated with that first civilization. You might think that's a bit of an overreaction, and that's fair. So let's run through a short but not exhaustive list of what's currently attributed to the first civilization. Number 1, the Sarkaz Crown. Number 2, the Seaborn. Number 3, the gate Sami's demons come out of. Number 4, Calcet and the Doctor, and also the Priestess. Number 5, the Sarkaz Sancta split. And the big one, number 6, Originium, and by extension, Infection. So yeah, it's getting a little crazy. Not completely out of hand yet, but I'd rather it not become the source of all things bad or all things going wrong in Terra. Mainly because I do want some stuff to have developed naturally. Obviously, as the first civilization, stuff is going to have come from this society and affect the world going forward. And that's more than okay. And I don't want these unique civilizations that have cropped up across Terra to eventually go back to being 13,000 years ago. Some random person decided they wanted to settle in this random area, and through the magical power of time, boom, all of Arknights lore. Now, you might think that's just me being like doomorist about it, and I probably am being a little. I would just rather this be a kind of low sci-fi setting and not this high sci-fi that they seemingly are building up to in order to push Enfield. And with that just being said, Enfield. I'm of two minds of Enfield. One, I'm kind of excited for the game, but two, it might bode badly for the future state of Arknights. Enfield, of course, is a spin-off game, but depending on the game's popularity, it might overtake Arknights itself. And based on the current trend of like 3D anime games and how popular they are, I would say that's a likely bet. Not necessarily that's going to happen, but very potentially. And depending on how much Enfield is pushed within the original game, I do think the quality of the game might suffer. But that's not an issue we have to worry about just yet. So, quick recap. Overall, story's in a good place. I don't think it's in a spot where it's about to ruin itself, except maybe on the Enfield Hill, but that's not exactly Arknights' fault if the devs try to push that game at the cost of the original. But I want to hear your thoughts. Is Arknights' story cooked? Let me know down below. Y'all be good people, and I will talk to you in the next one.